Welcome back to Second Breakfast. Today we are talking about Game of Thrones. Today's chapter is Jon 2. It seems to be one of the last of our full family Winterfell. I mean, Bran's already kind of down for the count, but one of our last full family Winterfell chapters already somehow.
Yeah, I think this is the moment. This is like our last bit where the whole family's together and then everybody is split apart, ne'er to return.
So we've been doing this for the last few episodes. Obviously, spoiler alert for the whole series and the show and the books and all that. We're trying to talk about in fullness of all context this story, so it's going to have some spoilers in there. But
yes, 100%.
On that note, we're like 10 chapters into this book, and
I know, crazy.
We're already hitting moments of like, oh, that's the last time they're ever going to see each other.
I know, yeah, brutal. Yeah,
it's very sad.
It really is sad. It's like it feels like all of a sudden we've gone from introductions where we're meeting everybody, and now it's like, oh, everybody's splitting up, because it really does happen so quickly. I mean, I think in the show, like it's episode 2 where everybody splits off. Like it jumps right in. The whole family is not together for very long.
Speaking of jumping right in, let's get to the recap of the chapter.
What a seamless transition. I'm really proud of that one. That was really good. So I'm going to give a brief recap of the chapter in case you haven't read it, / it's been a while, / you need reminders, etc., etc. This is a very short chapter, the shortest by far.
5 pages.
It was a quick one. They're all fast, but anyway, this one was very short, but still chock full of meaning that I'm really excited to talk about. So again, this is Jon number 2 from A Game of Thrones. So Jon is about to leave for the Wall, and he's like kind of like doing his rounds and saying goodbye to everybody. He goes to say goodbye to Bran first. He hasn't seen Bran since Bran had his fall / toss, because Catelyn hasn't left Bran's side for one moment, and Jon and Catelyn, of course, don't get along, but Jon's like worried he's never going to see Bran again, so he's like sucks it up and goes inside. Catelyn is, of course, angry that he comes to see Bran, but he's just like, I want to see my brother, like, shut up. And he's like looking at Bran, like, Bran does not look good, and is kind of saying goodbye to him. And Catelyn is still there, and she kind of says more to herself than anything. She says that she had prayed that Bran could stay behind at Winterfell. And then she says sometimes prayers are answered. And she's like saying this with like bitter tone. And Jon like doesn't know what to say, and he goes, "It wasn't your fault." And Catelyn just says, "I need none of your absolution, bastard." She's so mean to him in this scene. I mean, she's so upset about Bran, and so you understand why, but it's still truly horrible, especially because Jon's 14 years old. Anyway, and then as Jon's leaving the room, Catelyn says, "It should have been you," and then bursts into tears. It's pretty brutal.
Loses the moral high ground there.
Yeah, she really does. And so then Jon leaves the room and he runs into Robb, and Robb is also he says goodbye to him as well. And Robb promises that they'll see each other again soon. They wouldn't. And then
little Ron Howard action there.
And then Jon's final goodbye is with Arya. And so he goes to say goodbye to Arya as she's like packing to go down to King's Landing, and he gives her a sword that he had specially made for her. It's very small, very thin, and very light. And he tells her to when she gets down to King's Landing, to watch the boys fight in the yard and to find a partner to practice with. And Jon tells Arya that the sword is called Needle because all swords have names. All the good swords have names. And then they say goodbye, and the last line of this chapter says that the memory of her laughter warmed him on the long road north. And that's it, and that's the end. And that is like the breaking of our fellowship here. Like that is the true breaking apart of everybody, because after this is a Dany chapter, and then after that is I looked ahead, people are on the road. So this is it. This is the end before things really take a turn.
Okay. So yeah. I think we're gonna. I like the breaking of the fellowship comparison. I think I want to keep that in mind through the discussion. But there are a couple long-standing theories that I want to sort of tie into a bow and move beyond, since we are leaving this early phase of Winterfell.
I think that's good.
One is the remixed Macbeth comparison that we've been talking about. We did a larger section on that last week because we had those great contributions from Peregrine. And this time, I think it's sort of like a final twist of the knife in the way George kind of set up Macbeth and then pivoted hard from it and then sort of echoed back in a really cruel and satisfying way. We know by this point, yes, there are certain things we don't know about Catelyn. Yes, the letter she opened about Jon Arryn could have had other secrets in it because no one else saw the contents of it. And I'm trying to keep that possibility open in my head, but we know she's not Lady Macbeth. If anything, Cersei is now. But when we see her at Bran's bedside, racked by guilt and grief, and in all of this inner turmoil trying to fix something that happened in the past, I feel like this chapter gives her a blood on my hands moment.
Oh, okay.
But it's so inverted.
Yeah.
Because it's not Lady Macbeth feeling guilty because she orchestrated the killing of the king.
Right.
It's a mother grieving a horrible, what she thinks is accident that befell one of her favorite kids.
Mm-hmm. And she thinks she like accidentally prayed for it, basically.
So hitting that Macbeth beat, but doing it so differently, I think is sort of the final statement there from George in how he's going to play with some of the Macbeth elements.
I like that, especially because you then have Cersei who feels no guilt about what she and Jaime did to Bran, and actually she's hoping that he won't wake up and that sort of thing. So maybe if she deals with some sort of guilt at some other point, I don't remember it, but at this point that we've not seen anything that says she does feel that. So that's interesting.
We've also been talking about distillation echoes a lot lately, which is sort of a specific kind of echo. We talk about that as sort of a literary device all the time, but distillation echoes are when something recurs in a way that makes the theme or the message or the subtext of it much more overt, where the symbolism is laid bare, or it's so plain that the characters pick up on it. And there are a couple of those here, because last time when we were talking about Bran and as being this like specter in between life and death, we talked about limbo a lot last week in the Tyrion chapter. I think that limbo comes back here when we have to look at it, right? When we visit Bran's bedchamber.
Yeah, we haven't seen Bran on the page until now. That's true.
But because it is so much more overt, because it's in our faces, I think there are other layers on top of that that sort of bring the limbo idea to a head. When Jon walks into this basically hospital room trailed by his new dog who's called a ghost, I think that's bringing that limbo thing sort of to a head.
Wow.
And we talked in the very first Game of Thrones episode about George R. R. Martin feeling like a coroner in his approach to fantasy. And that's basically the role Jon has here. Where he hasn't come to see him, but now he has to, and he's almost eulogizing his brother before he leaves with this dog called Ghost. I thought that was fairly damning.
Wow, yeah. He even, like, Jon points out in his own thoughts that Bran hadn't had time to name his wolf. So, like, he's sort of, like, mourning that, like, loss of potential from Bran in that way.
We also talked about Catelyn's arc, and I'm glad you hit this hard in the recap, because she is sympathetic in that we know where her actions and feelings are coming from. We understand her POV literally because we have chapters from her point of view, but we also understand Jon's, and there's a built-in sympathy to him because of how horribly he's treated by everyone, and because he's 14.
Because he's a child, so yeah.
But we talked about last time we were deep in the Catelyn story, this arc of an unwanted son. Yeah. Where she was hoping to get pregnant and have another child while cruelly dismissing Jon from being a part of the family at all.
Right.
And I think some of that comes back here when we see these two characters in a scene together with the elephant literally in the room. Because there's the true-born son there, Bran, who's been grievously injured, and then Jon there, and obviously that comes to a head with the should have been you line.
Yes.
But I think that sort of pays off and completes the arc of him being an unwanted son.
I like that. That's cool.
The last one is the animal-linked prophecies that we've played with. Bran was almost exclusively described in animalistic terms.
Yes.
During the chapter where he ultimately then failed to grow wings and fell from the building or was thrown from the building.
Yes.
And there are more of those here as we view Jon with Ghost at his side. There are more hard goodbyes. Bran is compared to a bird in the delicateness of his body in this basically hospital bed. So I feel like George is wrapping up a lot of these big ideas before we massively expand this world in the next few chapters and finally move past Winterfell.
I like that. Yeah. Well, because I had another thing that had sort of carried through from the other chapters we've been talking about. And I don't know if it's going to end here or maybe it's just going to become less overt here, and that we're not going to only be either directly following or surrounded by the Starks going forward, because we're about to all split off. But that's my just ongoing thoughts and ideas about sight and power and that sort of thing. But I sort of have a point to make beyond that this week. We've of course established Jon has this ability to see and remain unseen, and that gives him a lot of power. And that continues here. There's a lot of stuff in the narration about him looking at Catelyn and watching Bran and looking around and being able to see things, and also remaining unseen when he steps into the room to see Bran. Catelyn, at first, it looks like she doesn't recognize him, like she's just not paying attention, right? When he sees Robb, Robb's like, Uncle Benjen is looking for you. He told me to, like, you know, if I saw you, to tell him. And Jon's like, I have to do one more goodbye before I leave. And so Robb says, okay, then I haven't seen you, right? So there's a lot of that. But to connect it with Robb more and to extend it a bit, I'd like to do that for a moment, because Robb and Jon are so, I think they're really set up to be so opposite of one another. They're the same age. They're both 14. I think Jon is slightly older than Robb, like by a few months or whatever, just because that's how, you know, conception works. But like he's not, they're basically the same age, right? But they're presented in such different ways. Robb is this, you know, firstborn, like true firstborn legitimate son. He's going to become Lord of Winterfell eventually. He's tall, he has that Tully look, he's very handsome, he's got the auburn hair, he's very bold and, you know, has everything going for him. Jon is of course this outcast who looks more like the Starks and is like more long-faced, and obviously he's a bastard and he's in the shadows and all that. And so they're sort of like these opposites of one another, but they don't seem to have any like
rivalry.
Yeah, they get along very well. When Jon runs into Robb out in the yard, basically, it says that Robb is like, you know, he's in the middle of it, shouting commands. He seemed to have grown of late, and Grey Wind was at his side, and so he like feels like taller and older, and he's like really, because now that Ned's about to leave, Robb will be the like, you know, interim Lord of Winterfell. And so he's like taking on this role where he's like in the middle of it and like is seen by all, right?
The man of the house.
Right. Whereas of course Jon is sneaking around, he's avoiding detection and all of that, and he's unseen. And even when he goes to see Arya doesn't notice that he's there at first. It's only when Nymeria smells ghosts that Arya realizes that Jon is even there. And I was interested in that sort of dynamic and that contrast, because Robb, we know, of course, spoiler, does not live very long compared to Jon, and Robb is not successful in what he sets out to do. And if we connect seeing and being unseen with like having power, that makes sense. What's even more overt here, though, is this sort of like these promises that both of these, I was going to say both of these boys make. You know, because Robb says to Jon that, oh, we're, like Jon says, how long do you think it'll be before we see each other again? And it says, soon enough, Robb promised. And of course, Robb is not able to keep that promise because they'd never see each other again.
It's a hope, right?
Right, but like it's a promise that he intends to keep, but he cannot. And that same thing happens when he promises to honor this betrothal to Walder Frey's daughter. And of course, he does not honor that promise, and that's what ultimately kills him.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing being the oldest son there, because he's working with this borrowed false authority because he's trying to fill these much bigger shoes. So what he means is a hope, he says is a promise.
Yes.
It's that little jump he has to make in authority.
Right. And it's not a judgment on Robb. It's just he's unable to keep that.
But it's a beautiful aspect of his character.
Right. And then, there's a contrast.
Yeah.
Like there's a direct contrast with a promise that Jon makes. When Jon's talking to Arya, it's Arya's like, who am I going to practice sword fighting with? And it says, you'll find someone, Jon promised her. And that one, of course, does come true. Arya finds her Bravosian dancing instructor down in King's Landing. Again, Jon does not actually have the power to like prophesy and declare who Arya will find to practice sword fighting with, just as Robb does not have control to prophesy when he and Jon will see each other again. But both of these boys are making promises as hopes, and one of them is right and one of them is wrong. And I think it's interesting that the one who is right is the one who has this power with sight versus the one who does not.
but they are different kinds of promises as well. Robb's is him promising to do something that he rationally knows he can't control. Jon's is a mark of faith in Arya, that she will find someone to train with.
Sure. Yeah.
So that promise is more of a testament to her character than a declaration that he's going to do anything.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of promise.
Oh, sure.
And I think it's more reasonable.
Yeah. It was just striking me as very interesting that like both of these, boys are making these promises that are impossible really to determine, and one's able to do and one's not. And then just looking at their track records, where Jon is pretty honorable and does what he says he's going to do, compared to Robb, who doesn't always do that. So
sure,
I was struck by that, and I want to track some of that stuff with Robb going forward, because Robb is somebody I don't think about very much, mostly because he dies pretty early on in the story. And so when I think about all my favorite Game of Thrones characters, I think about the ones that survived to seasons 7 and 8 and not Robb. So
but 3 out of 5 books is not too early on.
Right.
That's a lot.
Yeah, no, you're right. And also we just haven't had a POV from him. Do we
never
ever
will.
No. Yeah, we never do. So that's also part of it.
We don't get POVs from any of the kings.
That's right. Yeah. We don't get Robert. We don't get Robb. We don't get Stannis or anybody. Yeah.
So I always have that sense of distance with Robb, but I enjoy the nuggets we get about him. Lingering on the subject of age for a second, I had something to say about that. I'm glad you brought that up, because there is something beautiful and sad and melancholy about the way some of these characters interact in this chapter, because Catelyn's the only adult who talks here. The rest of it is...
That's true. All kids. Yeah.
It's kids trying to navigate really mature, difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
And specifically Jon and Robb in the courtyard. They are playing. They're play acting at adulthood, right?
Yeah,
They're they're clanking around in Ned's boots. And there's a warmth between them. And it's almost funny, because there is a pretension to the way they're trying to communicate and hold themselves and walk. And there's something almost silly about it, like when kids dress up.
Right. Like in a way that when you're 14, you don't realize how silly that looks. And it would devastate you to know that it seemed funny, like, because you want so badly to be taken seriously as an adult when you're that age. But
there's something noble about it as well, because they are trying to step up and take care of their mom and the rest of the family. They're trying to pitch in the way that they can, or the way that they might be expected to later on.
Right.
Which makes it heartbreaking, because you realize in this transitional moment that all of these characters, their childhoods are over now. And we know, just benefit of hindsight, that it's all downhill. For all of them, I mean, they're going down very different hills, but no one's life's going to get better after this chapter. I mean, the example, I guess, is that we know Robb and Jon will never see each other again after this chapter.
Right. Yeah.
And that breaks your heart. But the melancholy, the tragedy, from only a few lines of dialogue, from only the briefest interactions in total that we will ever see between those two characters. The fact that this chapter is 5 pages and basically has 3 full scenes. There's the Bran Catelyn visit, the Robb interlude, and then the Arya scene, which has the most runway there.
Yeah.
It's incredible how much characterization is happening there. And it made me zoom out, and I think we're getting more to grips of the type of fantasy that George R. R. Martin is weaving here. And I'm blown away by how much he respects his characters, even and especially while he tortures them. Because no one is ever just an extra or a kid or an ornament just hanging on the edge of a scene. There's a remarkable depth of feeling in his writing. And especially for these POV characters who we get unqualified and unvarnished. When Jon was watching the procession of all the King's Landing people, we got his opinions of them. Uncharitable, adolescent, whatever, the way that he dismissed and characterized some of them. There is this rigid, ironclad lack of presumption, where George, you can see him trying to embody these people's lives and not pull any of those punches. He's curious and open about how they view the world. There's a lack of judgment for his POV characters. He's not writing down to any particular age bracket. Right. These kids know what's going on in this scene. It's not that they can't understand it because they're young. There's this sense of loss and anxiety that he's exploring fully.
Right.
It reminded me of that coroner label, because there's no judgment for a body. when you walk in, and whether you're doing an autopsy or whatever, however far you want to extend the metaphor, there's something very matter of fact in how the body is just there.
Sure.
And presented.
Yeah, it's not hidden. You don't hide from it.
And I feel like George's style of writing is meeting the characters at their face level. Yes. With this endless depth of feeling, but there's something very plain-faced about how he engages with them. And I thought it was a beautiful mark of respect that this didn't feel like a condescending YA version of a chapter. Even though it's completely dealing with kids.
Sure, because that is one way you could approach writing this series, is that like when you read from Jon, it feels YA. When you read from Arya, it feels middle grade. You know, like that would be a really interesting way to do it, to sort of like mix genre and age and that sort of thing. But I don't think I would particularly like it personally. I think it's an interesting idea, but yeah,
I think you'd hate that.
Right. But also at the same time, these kids are not written like adults. Like Arya's, when I read, especially like with Arya, right? Arya doesn't feel like an adult. She doesn't have adult thoughts, right? But she's a child who is confronted with adult realities and is taking it in the way a child would. And it's the same thing with Jon and Sansa and everybody else. So yeah, I'm really struck by that. And I think we're going to get to dive into that in a really interesting way with Dany next chapter. Yeah. And that's also where that age conversation, I think, is going to really pay off. If we're looking at like Distillation Echoes and kids being presented, or young people being presented with really horrific circumstances, of course, that's going to be the meat of the discussion next week. I want to return to another one of our sort of ongoing theories, unless you have something related to. I have some notes about structure and Dany. All right, sure. But yeah, so about Dany? Just about how her chapter is next, and like, what does that mean? Oh, okay. Or I can do that later. No, that's interesting. Okay. We've never really done that. Right, because I was, we don't have a read ahead here. Like, we try to like just talk about the chapter as we've experienced it, without letting anything else inform us beyond what we vaguely remember from reading or watching. But we always see what's next, and Dany's next, and we've been talking about how this feels like this is a breaking point moment. This is when our fellowship separates. Like, this is when things change. And I think even if I hadn't looked ahead and saw that Dany was next, and then looked at the next chapter and made sure we weren't still at Winterfell, and we're not, I think it would have still been very clear that this is like our final goodbye to the Stark family altogether and to Winterfell as we know it, just because of the way it's written. And I was thinking about that and sort of what that might mean, because we've had a lot of goodbye chapters. We have this one, obviously. The one before this was Tyrion, who, like, they talk a lot about like, we're about to head out, that sort of thing. And then before that, Bran's trying to say goodbye to everybody before he leaves, and then is tossed. But so it's been a lot of that. And then I'm thinking about, okay, like, how was all this structured? So I went back and like looked at all the chapters we looked at so far, and Dany's chapters, at least right now, seem to be sort of segmenting these different parts of this book so far. I mean, we're only about like 10 chapters in, but it goes prologue, Bran, Catelyn, and then Dany. And so in that first chunk, you've obviously got your prologue, our first Bran chapter, which is steeped in prophecy and is just an introduction to everything. And then Catelyn, which is the inciting incident. Jon Arryn is dead, right? And then we have the first Dany. And then in between that Dany and then the Dany we're about to have, we've got Ned, which is when King Robert arrives to Winterfell. Jon, which is where we learn about Jon as a character, and Tyrion, and we get some prophecy stuff. We get Catelyn number 2, which is when we get the letter from Lysa, and Ned decides he's going to be the Hand, and like that is sort of like we're starting to open our eyes to the world, right? Then we get Arya. We are introduced to her. We really haven't seen her at all before then. And we get some sort of prophetic things about her and her character, and her connection with Jon. Then we get the second Bran, which is Bran saying goodbye to everybody. We get some prophetic things about him as a three-eyed raven. And of course, then the fall. Then we get Tyrion, which is like our first like major introduction to the Lannisters. We get some prophecy stuff. We learn more about the villains, and we're preparing to leave Winterfell. And then we get this Jon chapter, which is like a true goodbye to Winterfell. And then we've got our next Dany chapter, which then I think starts off this new section of the book, because the next one is Ned and they're out on the road. And so I really want to just track these Dany chapters going forward, because I know that George isn't just randomly throwing them in there. You don't get as many Dany chapters because her story is so separate from everything else, and the pacing is just different, especially when you get to like Clash of Kings. They're like 5 Dany chapters. Like it's really, really brief. So I really want to just pay attention to that structure going forward and see how that sort of demarcates and delineates these books. Because these are like, 800,000 page books, and there are no parts. Like a lot of long books will have like book 1, book 2, or part 1, part 2. These books don't have those. It's just character POVs.
I guess they sort of do. These now feel like checkpoints.
Right. So yeah, I want to just, I don't remember these Dany chapters having specific, being this intentional before, but I wasn't paying attention to that. So I'm saying I want to pay attention to that.
It's a very convincing argument.
That's all I wanted.
I'm completely committed to this.
Okay,
now.
great.
That's very cool.
If it ever is off, I'm going to be really disappointed. But anyway, I'm just going to.
For this week, it's perfect.
It's perfect. Anyway, I'm gonna track it and see, and also just see like what's happening in her story in each of these chapters, and how is it connecting to the section of the book that everybody else is in. So anyway.
Yeah, and I do feel, that's why I'm trying to go through this theme of sort of tying things into a bow, because it does feel like we're about to move into a bunch of new places, new people, new ideas.
Yes.
My last point is tying one of the bigger theories we've had into one. I made the point last week that I thought Death and Prophecy were sort of fused into one larger idea with the limbo progression that we got. Now, I'm still committed to that, but to go back to Death and Prophecy as individual but connected concepts for a minute, they hang over this chapter fascinatingly. So I need to set the table, and then I'm gonna drive forward and then back over it.
Okay, great.
You'll see what I'm doing here.
Okay,
so,
cool.
In order, we have Death and Prophecy as the big ideas for this chapter.
Okay.
Death comes first. We have Death hanging over Bran.
Yes.
And we have Death almost as this curse thrown out by Catelyn when she tells Jon that he should have been the one who, they think Bran's going to die at this point, possibly. So she means that as Jon should have died.
Yes.
And then we have Prophecy, where Jon and Robb are wondering about the future. And then and that's sort of in the air of that conversation of how fated these boys' destinies are and where they will end up. And, then we move on to Arya, who is gifted this foreign sword. And we know that will...
She's going to go to Braavos.
That will set her on that path, basically. It is this talisman of her future.
That's true.
And then for his own right, Jon ends this chapter by riding north, which is sort of the fortune cookie version of the rest of his life.
Yes, right.
So the cool thing is you can now double back over these Death and Prophecy incidents and multiply the resonance.
Okay.
So the Death ones are also about prophecy, and the Prophecy ones are also about death.
Okay.
So the first Death one was Death hanging over Bran.
Yeah.
But Bran's time in this limbo is incredibly prophetic of his later disembodied three-eyed raven future.
Absolutely, yes.
And Catelyn throwing out this like death curse at Jon, her making this wrongful death observation sets up her and Robb's ultimately untimely demises, right?
Yeah.
And that there's this idea underneath that of narrativity being broken.
Yeah.
Like Bran had so much to live for, and so much that was supposed to happen for him, and now that's been taken away from me. That feels so wrong and rude almost to the narrative that I had in my head. Similarly, the Red Wedding will feel somehow incomplete or wrong,
of course,
and jarring, because it does break that narrativity for us.
Yes.
Because these characters had so much left to do to
it
complete their little arcs.
Cuts off your arcs, exactly. That was, I think, the most shocking thing ever in this whole series was the Red Wedding. I mean, Ned is pretty shocking too, but you kind of see...
He's at the end of his arc.
You see it coming, in a way. Yeah.
How interesting to hear Catelyn have a reaction to, sort of her own death here.
Yes, very cool.
And then if you take the prophecy moments, those are also about death. So the first one is Robb and Jon in the courtyard wondering about the future. Seeing Robb's like amateur leadership teases his own later promotion as the head of the family, which only happens because of the death of his father.
Sure. And then he also fumbles it and doesn't do a very good job. Yeah.
And then you have Arya's Braavosi sword, which foreshadows a couple things. It's her future as a death-dealing assassin.
Yes.
But it's also that storyline she gets to of being a girl with no name.
Yes.
This identity crisis that culminates in the death of the self, basically, for her to become this agent of this assassin's guild. To call the sword needle is to root this talisman in that earliest incarnation of her identity crisis. Because Jon says it's named after your favorite thing.
Yeah,
which
right.
is referencing the resentment she has for this identity that has been laid out for her.
Yes, yes.
So there's death in that prophecy as well.
Cool.
And the death of the self, I mean.
Yeah.
And then the last one, which is the prophetic Jon riding north as a way to wrap up the chapter. Jon's ride north is prophetic as it is proverbial, because it puts him on a collision course with the White Walkers, who are death incarnate.
Yes.
Death walking, death's,
Yes.
counter. And it will also end in his own
His
death.
actual death, yes.
In
right.
the north.
Yes. Very, very cool.
So there's death in the prophecy, there's prophecy in the death. You can go forward and you can back over this chapter. And these things just keep this echo chamber of themes.
You know what I'm thinking about is Dany's dream: to go forward, you must go back.
And
just
but
saying.
to do all this within 5 pages,
Yeah.
to have this like cacophonous resonance of themes and ideas is pretty incredible.
That is very, very cool. I like that a lot. And this is making me think about, when I was talking about Robb and Jon's promises and whatever, a lot of these things that you're talking about are either stated by or done by Jon. Like when Jon goes to visit Bran, he asks Bran not to die. He says, Bran, please don't die. We're all worried about you. We're all waiting for you to wake up. When he is talking to Robb, Robb is the one who says, we'll see each other again. Jon does not say it. When he's talking to Arya, he of course says, you're going to find somebody to practice with. He also says, we're going to see each other again. She says, like, I'm going to miss you. And he says like something like, different roads can lead to the same castle. Who knows? And we know that eventually comes true. They are reunited in Winterfell many, many years from now. And I don't know how it'll play out in the books, because that's when the show is past the books. But still, we know they're probably going to be reunited eventually, right? And then, of course, he sets himself off on, the path to the wall. So it's all sort of done by, or, from the request of Jon, which is a fascinating thing to think about. If Jon is like our, quote, main character, Not that Jon has like the ultimate power and can set everything, He
should have, but yeah.
Right. But like, and if we're going back to like Jon's the ultimate, like invisible, can see all guy, like that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I'm maybe this is a good way to wrap up the episode, but I'm very interested in you referencing these books as like 800, 1,000 page doorstops. And that's how people think of them. When you see that little mass market at the airport.
It's the thickest thing you've ever seen.
Yeah. It's just this huge brick.
Yeah.
But the fact that we don't have to work to wring so much more out of these 5 pages. I feel like the implication, the subtext, the subconscious of these characters in these situations, I feel like the real version of these books is 10 times thicker.
Yeah, I know
like,
what you mean.
There's an incredible, that's why I was talking about respect and depth of feeling before, because I feel like for every word that is on the page, there's almost an hour of thinking that George has put into fleshing out this world.
Yeah, I mean, every time I sit down to read this book for this, like, and we like look at the chapter, and like, this week we're like, it's only 5 pages, and I'm always have a little bit of a worry. I'm like, oh no, what if I'm not going to have anything to say? Like, it's only 5 pages. What could I possibly have to say about 5 pages? And then of course, I don't even have to try, and things just leap out at me, and like, I'm immediately having thoughts and wanting to think. And the more I think, the more thoughts I have, the more you and I talk, the more ideas I have. Like, it's just, there's so much there. And I'm so pleased with how rewarding this is.
But somehow it also flows.
Right.
And reads as easy as Stephen King.
Yeah, it's not dense. It's not hard to read. It's not a slog to get through. It's not like, oh, there's so much and it's so rich, which like can be code for it's really hard to read. Like, you could read this just like casually and not think too hard about any of this stuff and still have a great time, or you can like dive in the way that we're doing here and also have a great time.
You know where else you can have a great time?
Oh, is it on our Patreon?
Yes, it is. This month we have 2 bonus episodes. Usually there's every month you're guaranteed 1 bonus episode, and we've got I think 20 in the back catalog that you can get access to for $2 a month, but you also get the brand new one every month. This month we have 2. We have the Breakfast Buffet, which is dropping in, I think, 2 weeks-ish. And that one will be talking about 4 fun, very different new movies. Anyone But You, The Beekeeper, The Zone of Interest, and
All of Us Strangers.
All of Us Strangers.
Yeah.
But this past Sunday, we dropped another bonus episode for the month of February, and that is us discussing Godzilla -1 minus color, the black and white version of the fantastic new Godzilla movie. We talked about the normal version in last month's Breakfast Buffet, but we got to see it in black and white in theaters, and that was an incredible experience. So we've got that episode up for you. That's like almost 2 hours of bonus content just for this month.
Pretty great. Love
Support the show. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching.
Yes.
We'll be back in just a few days on Tuesday with a brand new episode.
Please comment down below what, if you're on YouTube or Patreon, what you thought about this chapter, about the things we discussed, about ideas you want to pitch in. Last week we had a lot of listener feedback, which was really fun to incorporate. So we love hearing from y'all. Also, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're on other podcast platforms, add us somehow. I don't know, subscribe, add it to your whatever. You leave a review, click the things,
Have a wonderful weekend.
Have a wonderful
and thank you
weekend.
for joining us. Bye.